All right, so I'd like to thank everybody for showing up today. I'd like to introduce myself. I am Anson Blanks. I'm the new customer success scientist for Photonics. My role is to ensure everyone's satisfaction with all of our products, as well as to help you achieve your experimental success using Novo Floors. If you have any questions after the webinar, or if anybody wants to share their success that they've had with Novo Floors, definitely feel free to shoot me an email. I'll put my email in the chat box. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A function down at the bottom of the screen. We definitely like for this to be an interactive webinar, so I'll be interrupting Mike with any questions that you may have as we go along. And with that, I would like to introduce our host, Mike Stamisky, who earned his BS in biochemistry from Clemson and his PhD in microbiology and immunology from the University of Virginia. Mike has vast experience in flow cytometry, as he is the former CEO of FlowJo and the current CEO of Photonics. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Great. Juggling monitors here, so. Great, so hopefully you can see that we're about to go swim with elephants. Anson, can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, cool. Big welcome to Anson. This is actually his first webinar, so I'm super excited for this. And it's always better to have someone to swim in the pool with elephants with you. So yeah, as he said, please do interrupt us with questions, and he'll be moderating that. Make sure you put it in the Q&A box, not the chat. That way we know and can queue those up to answer live. But specifically, what elephants are we going to be swimming with today? And I think it's worth calling these out. And so the first one is we're going to talk about conventional dye performance. What does that mean? What are the two different types of conventional dye performance? And also, what does it speak to in terms of the current innovation epochs, the current innovation timelines that we have in flow cytometry? And we'll link that later on into single cell and single cell sequencing. To that point, we'll also talk about innovating in critical infrastructure, and then also some customer stories about customers who are using Novo Floors and some of other technology in their experiments and why they're using them, because I think it's equally as important. And the final part of this, we'll go through implications for life science and also single cell biology. What does it mean, when you've got the kind of platform that we'll be talking about today and the number of floors that we have? But I think the first thing I want to talk about is actually just conventional dye technology. I think it's important to provide some context. And I think it also shows us how we've ended up where we are in flow cytometry today. But the kind of step back question is, well, what is conventional dye performance? And so really conventional dyes actually only perform in two different ways. And we'll talk about two of the fundamental technologies here that lay beneath this, sort of the good, the bad, and sort of the other things which we could say are just a push. And so the first type of conventional dye performance, which is the one that we're probably all most familiar with, is the dye performance that we get from something like phycoerythrin PE or the PE conjugates or per-CP, where they might be narrowly emitting, but they're cross-excited by a broad set of lasers. And in fact, we see this, almost being inherited by the instruments that we use, right? By having very few numbers of detectors in the blue. And that's almost entirely because of this cross-excitation that you see off of the blue and then the yellow or green lasers. And, that's a pernicious issue, not just because you can't leverage the flow capabilities of an instrument, but also because you get this spillover spreading, right? And we'll talk quite a bit about this, but I like thinking about this, and there's a great article, and I'll throw the reference up in a moment, where it talks about the trumpet effect that you get from spillover spreading. And it's caused by this type of cross-excitation. And you can get that spread because of this type of performance or the next type of performance. And you'll see we strive to create fluorophores that actually don't have this spread, but you can see it actually affects your data analysis, right? How are you supposed to distinguish one population from another? The second type of dye performance really comes on, as a result of the Serogen dye technology, which we'll also describe in a moment. And that is that they might be narrowly excited. For instance, they're only excited off the 4 or 5, the violet line, but then they have a very broad emission peak, right? And so you can actually see that, and then that also leads to spillover. And in fact, we've gone ahead and quantified that in very high panels where we're leveraging something like a brilliant violet 510. And what you can actually see again is you actually see this. We actually quantify, if you will, this spillover spread. So again, to focus in on this for a moment, because we'll show you how our floors perform in this, and I think it's an important bar for us to put out there, is that in an ideal situation, if you were looking at a population that was APC size 7 positive here on the y-axis, but PE size 7 negative, the ideal situation for post-compensated data would be that the medians of both these populations line up. I think we all can appreciate that. But let's sort of put some more on that, which is that ideally there would also be, in essence, the same standard deviation in between these populations, right? You could analyze this data very easily. You could use automated analysis with some facility, and it wouldn't be a problem. Now, the reality of the situation is that you get this spillover spreading error, right? Which we think has a pretty big issue when you consider that now you might even be able to get spurious double positive events because you just have so much spillover. The way I like to think about this, and this is based on some of the phrasing that Monica DeLay uses from Cytech, and I really like it. And it's that if you think about this, what this is saying is that APC Cy7 is really the perpetrator, and PE Cy7 is the victim. And the victim is really, you're having spread into this victim channel. And so we've taken this and sort of looked at it in a really sort of larger context and said, okay, that being said, what would be, if you had all of the traditional dyes that were perpetrators, you could actually sum up the amount of victimization that they put into all the other dyes in an experiment, right? You can think about this as having 20 or 30 other victims if you're running a high plex panel. In fact, that's exactly what we've done in some of the high parameter work that we've done, and we'll touch upon this in a moment, because I think it has a pretty big impact on panel design and then how you can leverage clean fluorophores in this context. But if you actually look at the victim sums, in other words, we've summed up all of the different spreading error that each one of these victim dyes adds into other channels. So you can think about this as noise into the measurement. And you can see that after this BB515 FTSE combo, which is incredibly challenging to deconvolute and spreads quite a bit into one another, the next one is actually this BB510, this brilliant violet 510, which we just talked about, has this broad emission profile. This is actually something we're going to come back and actually solve for. So we'll put a pin in this for now, but it's important to just note that when we look at this, we really are very focused in on how do you limit this kind of spread, and what's the impact of that on hardware, and also your ability to ask multiple questions in an experiment. And then, so what's driving this, right? And the answer is, it's also worth taking a look at conventional dye technology, because obviously we're going to position and talk about a new technology for this. The first type of conventional dye technology is tandems, right? We're all very familiar with these, the P and the APC tandems. There's a whole menu of these. The great thing about tandems is that you get FRET. You have the ability to access more wavelengths and get more emission that's out farther into the red, because you can get this energy transfer in between the two fluorophores. The problem is that when you take these tandems and you put them onto an antibody, the first thing is that chemistry actually changes the fluorescence, right? That's actually laying underneath this. That's why for individual single stain controls, we need to run that specific antibody with that specific tandem, right? Which gets very difficult once you get into dim markers. There's the added complication of having to run on beads, which might have a different profile of cells. And the final one that I think is probably way worse just from a practical use perspective is their stability, the stability of these tandem dyes. So we got some data here from Paul Wallace. And what he's looking at here is actually you've got APC size 7. And as it degrades, you actually see more APC signal. And you can see that if you just leave this tandem, APC size 7, in fixative, right, for just 72 hours, you get this massive degradation in the actual tandem. That's size 7 actually coming off of the FRET. And so the stability of these is really quite weak. And so this is yet another requirement that we'll put out there. So we've talked about spread, now we've talked about stability. It's another requirement we'll put out there for our technology. The other two types of conventional dye technology are Serogen Labels, really coming out, on our floors really in the 2010s, early 2010s. They're incredibly bright, right? And that's because they essentially harvest FRET through this antenna, where you get this FRET transfer and antenna transfer into a reporter dye. And so you essentially accumulate that and can really get incredibly bright dyes off of this. It opened up the violet and the UV, which has been amazing, right? These are really the two new laser lines we've been able to add onto that. However, there's a trade-off: spread, which we've discussed, and then also some practical use effects. You've got to stain at least 2 hours before. You've got to stain 2 hours before or within that window, and then there's also special buffers to prevent aggregation between these different fluorophores, because of the way the polymers are interacting with one another. So there's some limitations there. There's also a very different polymer. Even though I think we've been labeling both as polymers in the field, is really this new single dye multimer technology. This is not the only one, but this is sort of the Caravia technology, right? You do get better stability than FTSE. You can get spectrally clean, but because it is just a single dye multimer, FRET is not possible. So you're limited, incredibly limited wavelengths. You're not going to get long stow shift. You're not going to be able to get out really far out into the red. And there's only one dye to date, right? And versus what I'll show you today. And I think importantly is in how do we frame this in terms of what's occurred in the field of flow. right? So I'll show you and have to convince you that dyes have always driven hardware development. That's continued to date, although we'll talk about what the implication for hardware is now. Software has largely, honestly, punted on panel design. It's been largely heuristic, dealing with the compromises of a lot of these dyes that we're talking about. And in many cases now, I'd say phenotyping and discovery are really unlimited by the data quality, right? Both standardization and then also the data quality you're getting off the back end, some of the issues that we've discussed already. But reagents continue to be this critical infrastructure need that really are necessary to push the field forward. And I mean that broadly. I don't just mean fluorescence. You'll see I'll build this out. I'm really talking about all of single cell. And the first part there first point that I made was that dyes drive hardware development and thus democratization, which is a bit of another point. But dyes have always driven hardware development. We get the development of the first tandem dyes, which we've been talking about. Then you have, if you will, the development of the 12 color Vax Vantage catching up with that. Then you get the release of the quantum dots, which actually Seddon and our team worked on in the very early days. Then you get the response of the 18 color LSR2. Then the brilliant dyes, the Serogen dyes we've been talking about, and then the response of the Vax Symphony. So in every case, we're catching up to detect these number of dyes. And then similarly, as we've moved up this chain, of course, then you get the democratization of smaller benchtop instruments, into laboratories. Now, you could argue, okay, well, we're in a very different situation now. And so, but let's frame this a little bit differently. So we have the development of the Aurora and then the ID7000. These are spectral instruments that have 64 and 188 detectors, respectively. But why is that? And I think when we really think about this, and we think about this in the context of conventional cytometry, it really said, look, we really want to be able to ask more questions per cell. We want to go beyond this limit that we have, let's call it 28 to 32 parameters that we get out of conventional flow cytometry. So to do that, we have to accommodate the non-ideal performance and collect a signature of a label, right? To try and move that multiplexing higher. And really that's still a response to the underlying dye technology, right? And so note too, that across this entire span, we're underutilizing all the current infrastructure, right? Because for instance, on an Attune, which we use quite a bit of, right? A 13 detector instrument, but the second you show up to run an experiment with conventional dyes, you're running an 11 color experiment, right? And the same applies across this entire spectrum. So we'll talk about how to innovate across that in a moment. But the other thing too, I think is really important is, there's been a lot of talk in the spectral world around an inflow around a dye signature. But I think we have to be very careful about that because it's also framed, I think we need to frame it in that it is the result of a non-ideal dye performance, which has been used to great effect for phenotyping, without a doubt, but it increases the theoretical limit per panel, but it is in essence non-ideal performance. And so spectral is actually something that I've been talking about since 2016, a year before the release of the Aurora. I started talking around, well, what if we could use all the information from all these detectors? Could we go to full spectrum cytometry? We actually ran some proof of concept experiments where we ran both 8 parameter and then 25 parameter panels, but detected on 28 detectors. So we were already in an over detectored system, and we talked about some of the work I had done previously with deconvolution. And I think I certainly made some good predictions. I think the one I didn't push far enough, or one I got wrong, was what it's going to mean with respect to reagents. And in fact, signature is not necessarily more important than brightness. What I should have predicted was that actually hitting a detector cleanly is going to be more important than brightness. Because regardless, if you have a signature, you're adding spread in all of the non-primary channels. So to the point, what does an ideal fluorophore look like in this context? So I've called this perfect blue. I resisted the temptation to write perfect TM blue, but this would be the perfect dye, right? It would be bright because we don't care about the compromises of how bright it is relative to its spread because it's not a curve. It just hits that one detector at B1 incredibly cleanly, right? And I do this somewhat in jest, but it's not really, because that would be absolutely ideal. And then everything else that we have that is essentially a gradient where we move that to a tad less than perfect, not very good, and then we get into sort of the full signature world, right? Because at every step, what we're doing is adding spread into other detectors and also in many ways preventing our ability to leverage all of the detectors that are on this instrument. Something we'll come back to. Something we should have known that was going to occur though, right? So if we look at the history of technology, right? And I like looking at this in the context of, okay, what about the music that we listen to, right? And so the first part, when we think about this, is the Walkman comes out in 1979, right? And it was honestly a revolution in terms of you could take music with you. It was mobile music. That's a paradigm shift, right? This also becomes ubiquitous. The first MP3 player, right, was actually launched in 1998. It was the MP Man F10. And the reason we've never heard of that is because very quickly, about 3 years later, a young upstart, and it was an upstart at that point, which we forget because this is the lens of history that we have now, is that an underdog named Apple introduced the first iPod. And it was a complete underdog at that point, right? It only worked on the iMac. It only worked with iTunes, right? And there was obviously a lot of extrinsic software innovation that occurs between 1998 and 2001 to enable this to even occur. And then, of course, this becomes the dominant design on which we now know music playing. And then eventually we get its maturation in 2007 to be really a combined functionality, right? Where you've got both the phone functionality and music functionality come together. Arguably not much innovation since, right? I mean, the iPhone that I have, however many years later, 13 years later, is not significantly different than that in terms of functionality, right? So if we look at the history of technology, we get paradigm shift in ubiquity, a first mover disadvantage, but it actually shows you the way, dominant design from an underdog, and then combined functionality. This is exactly the same of what we're seeing in the hardware innovation world when we look at flow cytometry. The LSR2, which is essentially the Millennium Falcon of our field, right? Everyone's will run and experiment on LSR2. Shows the paradigm shift, right? It's the Walkman of our field, and it was ubiquitous. It still is ubiquitous, right? You cannot walk into a floor core without seeing one of these instruments. Then you have the CYTO, right? It comes out, and it really was, at that point, really a mind-boggling event, right? People were running 35, 37, 40 parameters. But it has a first mover disadvantage, right? Despite its other disadvantages, right? It shows us the way in terms of data analysis, in terms of high parameter, in terms of what we could do in a flow cytometry experiment. Then, very similarly, an underdog, Cytec, comes and really comes out with the dominant design, right? Which is the Aurora. And then someone builds on top of this. Actually, it was another company. It was Propel Labs. That actually then combines these functionality and say, you know what? Let's do sorting and analysis together. Let's put that in both the spectral and conventional context, right? And so I think what's important over the course of this is to think about, okay, well, where are we in terms of hardware innovation? What are the needs now? I would argue that from the release of the LSR2 until the point we are now, where we have a 7 laser sorter that's got both sort and analysis capabilities, there's really nowhere else to go in hardware, right? We've got both that 7 laser sorter, we've got a 7 laser instrument from Sony. Where else are we going to go? The spectrum is limited, right? We've got a lot to do in the IR with respect to labels, but the laser already exists. And in the DPV, there's other issues there, but yeah, certainly, again, the same story. Lots of labels to make there, but we have the lasers. There's nowhere else to go in the spectrum, right? I don't think we're going to go out to microwave, right, or these other types of wavelengths. Software, similarly, if you track this based on one of the first publications that was really sort of applying some more modern machine learning techniques like k-means clustering into this, and the work of Ryan and Raphael and some other really beautiful work here. That software innovation really followed the hardware innovation as we pushed up in terms of number of parameters. I would argue that we're towards the nadir of that software innovation epic, because we particularly with single cell and the number of algorithms that are out there now to analyze that data, we really aren't limited by the number of parameters. We are fundamentally limited by data quality, which is why reagents, and I really track this to 2018 being the commercial launch of sequence-tight antibodies, we are in the reagents innovation epic. And so we'll talk about, and we'll pick this thread up, right? But I think it's this critical infrastructure that's going to take us back. And if you think about this almost being a cycle, it will take us back in to software and hardware innovation. But we have a critical need in this infrastructure now. So how do you do that? What are customers doing with us on that front? So inside the control room, so all of the fluorescent labels that we make are based on this core technology called the Phyton. And what we do is we take small organic dyes, bind them onto these single-stranded oligonucleotides, and then anneal them to assemble this cruciform structure, which is the Phyton. That enables us an exquisite engineering platform, right, where we can actually engineer both the components and also the geometry with respect to fret on the platform, right? And so that's what enables us to actually do tunable excitation and emission. I'll show you what that means in a moment, and then what's the impact of that on discovering new biology. It also gives us a platform on which we can tune and optimize brightness, and it provides us an extreme amount of flexibility in terms of its targeting and as well as its conjugation, because we can hang a single-stranded oligonucleotide off of the end of this Phyton and conjugate it onto an antibody. And with that, we've actually addressed a lot of the requirements that I've talked about to date, and we've thought about this spectral space, I think, fundamentally differently, where we've said we're going to uniquely excite off of a laser and uniquely emit and hit those detectors incredibly cleanly, so that you can upgrade panels across any different type of instrument. And so I'll show you some examples of that. But to open that up more and say, okay, what are the requirements that we talked about early that were revealed by conventional dyes? The first one was bright and clean. I think we can all appreciate that. I would also argue that silent and the violet is a very important one. We have to protect the violet space for multiplexing. Some of our current dyes do not do that. They have to be consistent and stable. This is a really interesting and emergent one for us, one that we've continued to test with experiments about looking at how stable are they at room temperature, how light stable are they? Can you leave them in fixative? And the answer is yes. And so I'll show you some data on that, and also talk about making lot-to-lot inconsistency in dyes, a thing in the past. The final part of this is also a new to world capability, which is this notion of digital fluorescence. Could you actually use the notion of being able to tune the brightness of a label to really change the way you can think about panel design? If I've got a marker that's expressed low, I really want high brightness, and the inverse is true as well. So we'll talk about all of those capabilities and show some data to that. The first part of this, though, is bright and clean. And so if we think about this just in terms of the excitation, spectrum of something like PE dazzle, it's promiscuously excited really about 488, 532, and 561 lines. But we came in with a different thesis that said, well, what if you could separate the blue and the yellow-green excitation and independently stack those channels? And that's exactly what we've done. We've actually done that off of so for the first 6 fluorescent labels that we put out, off of the blue and then the yellow-green laser. And again, excited them independently off of those lasers, and then had very narrow emission on that. So what's the impact of that, right? And so I'll show you actually using some of our data and also some customer data to show what the impact of that is. The first thing is, and then to remind you what an ideal dye looks like, right, where the medians are all lined up and you don't have this broad distribution, you actually see that. So what we did here is took CD4 single stain controls, right, concatenated them post-compensation. And what you would expect to see is that large trumpet effect, right? You would expect to see this large amount of spillover spreading. And in fact, you just don't, right? Even off adjacent channels. We name our labels based on the excitation line, blue, and then our emission peak, 610. And you would expect with any other fluorophores that are excited and emitted this closely, right, that you would expect to see this trumpet effect. In fact, you don't. And we think this has a huge impact on the data analysis, right? So I've shown this in multiple different combinations across the blue and the yellow. But what you're seeing is largely you do not get spread. And we'll quantify this actually in 2 different ways today. We'll quantify this in terms of, well, how does some prototypical yellow and blue dyes that we make perform in the hands of the NIAID? And then also, how do they perform when you really push the plex, right? When you really push it up to 37, 40, 45 colors. The other thing that is a great question, and it's been awesome to see this from customers, is, okay, well, how are other customers using this, right? And how can we get access to this? So what we've done is put all those labels in the context with conjugation kits, right? Someone called this the best addition to Flow in the last 10 years. We've really strived to both make the technology both easy to use in terms of the workflow, right? Like, let's have a conjugation kit where it's an easy conjugation procedure, but then also makes the experimental design and data analysis easier for the reasons that I've already described. So what are customers doing? So I'll show some data here from Oliver Burden at the Babraham Institute. And the first thing that was really, is we've always been a don't take, sort of reading rainbows, don't take my word for it type approach. And we said, well, we made these CD4 kits available to say, well, go and quantify this, what we're talking about in terms of spectral clarity. Right? And so what he did is compared phycoerythrin to Novo Yellow 570, which is intended to replace. And, his words, man, these are excellent replacement for our panels, and they're much, much cleaner than some of the comparator dyes from BD, right? And so we're able to achieve that spectral clarity. And if you think about it, we're striving towards that ideal dye that I showed earlier. The other thing too that he took a look at was also this Novo block solution. This is a solution that prevents the background, some of the background staining that we see with our labels, but also all of the Cy-based tandems. In fact, just to show you some data from Seddon on our team, this is actually just looking at a monocyte marker on this x-axis and a T-cell marker on the y. And you can see without block, you get this, if you will, this drag up, right? You get this background staining. And so what we did is actually use Novo block and then also BioLegend's monocyte blocking true stain, and actually show that you could limit that background. Right. And so Oliver took that quite a few steps further. And so he tested block versus true stain versus FC block versus fax buffer and unstained, and really was looking at, okay, like how do we optimize for that for non-specific binding in the context of leveraging all of these Novo fluors. Show the Novo block, again, as you would expect, because it's specifically engineered to do this, does a great job in doing that. The reduction in non-specific binding is really fantastic. But the reason it really matters in his context, and I think this is why it's important, it's not just like, yeah, we've got a blocking solution, is also that he was able to extend this. And so he used a supernatant that was actually from liver cells. And the reason he did that was to mimic the presence of non-hematopoietic cells. And he really wanted to make sure that he can now look at essentially tissue-based cells, use our Novo fluors, use this blocking solution, and then have those conditions be optimized. Why does he do any of that? So he's running experimental flow-based CRISPR screening, which requires these incredibly clean signals, right? Essentially non-zero interference, but also having the ability to be bright. And so I think this is really interesting. This is an assay he's adopting from CYTO2020, which does have this ability of being very, very clean, although low throughput and some other issues there. And so I think it's really interesting because we're talking about going in there and bringing that assay off of the CYTO2020 platform into a high throughput flow cytometry environment because we have these clean signals. So excited to see more from him on this. The other part of this, and again, it's leaning on some customer data here too, was what about the practical aspects of this with respect to consistency and stability, right? Now, so I'll show you some data, a couple of slides actually from our partners at the NIAID. And so the first part of this is actually, and I show this graph and people are always like, well, wait, what am I don't see anything here. And that's the point. So what we're actually looking at here is actually the comparison across the spectrum with respect to two different manufacturing lots of our fluorescent labels. So we designed a spec, which is that it has to be less than 5% in terms of the variability when we look at it on a spectrophotometer. I'll actually show you what it looks like on a flow cytometer as well, because it's critically important for people who are creating these large panels and running them over a period of years and in several different clinical trials. But that's the point, is you do not see differences, right? And so again, with our customers in the NIAID, the first thing they did is actually they characterize the spillover spread, again, which is sort of our, if you will, a bit of our calling card to say, okay, well, how do these perform? They compared this Novo Yellow 610 dye to 30 other labels, and it's got the lowest spread that they've seen, right? And so I thought that was a really intriguing result. And similarly, Novo Blue was comparing really favorably to the other, the Brilliant Blue dyes in terms of spread. And again, they want to, that's great, and they want those clean labels, but also they really wanted to push this a step further when they consider it in the context of the panels they're constructing, which is how's this going to perform over time. And so what we did is actually provide them, again, two manufacturing lots actually of CD4 conjugated to all of our labels, looking here at the yellow, and we said, go look at separation index, because what if, our manufacturing is incredibly consistent, but the separation index should not be different between two different lots, right? Because we just want to hit that every single time. The biology should also prove that out. And the answer is yes. And so they found no statistically significant differences actually here. So I'm actually mapping out the two different lots with respect to the separation of CD4 across a titration. So we see that for Novo Yellow and we see that for Novo Blue. So we're really, again, we're striving to make that lot-to-lot inconsistency that you do see with other labels, and we run into, particularly as we've run some higher panels, by really pushing this further, right? And so, and again, this is in the hands of an outside lab, and now they can use this and say, okay, now we can count on that spectral performance, we can count on that consistency, and we can construct panels that we're going to use for the next five years. The next part of this is, we sort of jokingly call this the COVID experiment now, and we didn't realize it was going to be that, which is what we did is we took Novo Yellow conjugated CD3 and stained PBMCs, and then literally left them in fixative, 2% paraformaldehyde, which is a pretty abusive solution, right? If you remember earlier, APC Cy7 degraded after 72 hours. We actually just left it in fixative for 2 weeks. We didn't put it in fixative and then wash. We literally just put it in, left it in fixative. And you can actually see there's actually no difference after 2 weeks. So I think this really enables a really interesting workflows now when you can think about fixing your labels and having there be no difference. I also think incredibly relevant for those who are working with human samples, right? Because there's going to be a need to show that those are fixed and are also, safe for use. Again, we've taken that another step further. So what we did is we actually just left our antibodies. We call this a Europe experiment, and we're running Anson's running V2 of this now. Is we left our antibodies literally just in the, not on the bench, in a drawer. So they were light protected, but they were just in a drawer for 2 weeks, right? And then we came back and stained them versus those that had been left in the fridge, and found no difference. So they're incredibly stable. So a lot of this is due to the fact that we have this DNA-based platform that's stabilizing these dyes. And so I think it's really exciting when we consider what we can do in terms of extending this out and what types of workflows now we're able to do. The other part of this, actually, if you will, looping back on hardware innovation, we've also run, the 6 labels that I've mentioned on this Propel Labs Bigfoot sorter. You can see actually the data looks really quite good, and we're again achieving that kind of spectral clarity on that, and we're excited to really push that forward. So we're working with them and a customer too on can we use this for high parameter sorting as well, and do some really high purity sorting, because without the spread, then you can think about doing really high purity cell sorting. I think it's exciting work that's in progress there as well. Let me just take a pause there. Anson, do we have any questions? Or should I just keep the train rolling?
So we just got one. How many dyes do you currently have?
Man, that was like a perfect segue. I'll answer it in 2 slides. Fantastic. All right, we'll talk about that. And then, so what I'll also do is I'll actually get out of the presentation. I'll take a step further, and I'll show our fluorophore selection guide, which is actually something that Anson and I are working on quite literally today. So hopefully that answers your question and provides a little bit more depth on sort of how to navigate the dye environment. So awesome. Yeah, so that was, you know, even when I present the first 6 and we were working on the next wave, I always ask this question of like, okay, and then what else are we working on? To frame this up, you know, Mario Roeder's law for flow cytometry really was the number of colors doubles every 10 years. I've used this already when we talked about how dyes drive hardware innovation. And we had the first 6 BYG, which we released in early 2020. We followed that on with an additional 13 labels, so we've done 19 labels in 6 months. And so let me break that out for you, because we've done, several new labels on the blue and yellow lines, and then I started attacking also the red line. So the menu, and I'll show what the emission profiles of this look like, and then I'll also show this resource that Anson and I have been working on in terms of how do you navigate these fluorophores in the context of all the other fluorophores that may emit or excite in similar regions. Is that we've built out really 3 new to world dyes in the blue. We've also introduced this concept of digital fluorescence, which I'll show some data on in a moment, 4 additional dyes in the yellow, and then we've added 4 additional dyes in the red. And I think there's some important points here, which is also that if you're noting, we're able to hit, you know, these gaps of essentially 10 nanometers, right? Which in a spectral context means more multiplexing and cleanly, and I'll show you how we're attacking that in a moment. But for conventional cytometry, I think it gives you a huge amount of flexibility, because you could optimize your panel and leverage, you know, if you have a bandpass filter that's 50 nanometers, you could leverage that to give the most optimal panel to really space out how you're leveraging that instrument. So it's exciting. We've been working with a number of customers who send us this, and we have got really a menu of options that we can now leverage into that panel. The first thing was this interesting idea of digital fluorescence, and I was talking to a friend of mine who's not in flow, and I was trying to understand how to best communicate this. And the concept we came up with was, if you enter a dark room, you need a higher wattage bulb. But if it's a room with a lot of natural light, then you need a lower wattage bulb. And honestly, the same applies to antigen density. And so we actually name these based on their wattage level now. But this is data driven. So this is actually, these S numbers are actually the separation indices on CD4 as measured by us on Aurora, right? So I'll show you what that means now, right? And so for the Novo Blue 610, we actually have 2 different versions of this label now, a 30S and a 70S version. And you can actually choose your brightness based on the underlying antigen density. And I think this cuts both ways. I always thought about it in the context of, you know, let's go and detect things that are low antigen density and let's really make them brighter. Because I don't know, maybe that's an old school view of the universe. But I've been challenged by several of our customers that said, no, that's not the most important. What you could actually consider too is if you got something that's very high energy density, you could bring it back down, right? You won't have to mess around with the instrument. You could actually use this and then, if you will, take a lower brightness version of this and leverage that on that marker, right? And have less impact on spread and some of your other markers. And I thought it was a really interesting insight. And so we're offering those now as well. And we hope to build out, if you will, this suite of brightness version across several of the labels. To the point in terms of where does this stack up, we had 3 labels previously. Those are the ones we were talking about. And now we've got a number of these, both, if you will, further down in wavelengths, and then building out really in this large gap we had in between the 530 and 610, really to go in and replace FITC and some of the labels that excite near there. So the menu's here, and it's interesting because I was presenting, even when we did our launch, I was presenting some of our summaries like this in comparison to dyes, and I just honestly got really frustrated, right? Everyone bins relative brightness, or they put like a 4-box scale, and I don't really know what it's just binning. So, but what does that really mean in terms of the raw data? We also were the first to start quantifying spread, but even then we were using these kind of silly sort of like, you know, pie chart balls to communicate that. And I thought, man, there's got to be a better way. So what we've come up with, and then I'll actually cut over to the resource because I think it's just a lot more fun to see it live, is what we're doing is actually sharing the data, right? So for every label, you'll see an emission max, the laser line, which in this case is all this 48, this blue line, we'll actually show you the spread. And again, that's in context, right? Because it's the spread of all of these different labels measured at one time. And then also the separation index, right? So how bright is this thing? And you can see, I think when you navigate something like the blue laser, that enables you to see, okay, well, now I can look at which label is going to be the brightest for my application relative to these other dyes that I've either been using or am considering. And I think you'll also see, of course, we're sort of, again, this thing we've been really focusing in on is that a lot of these also, really focus in on having a low spread characteristic. You can see already that we've got dyes that span the brightness that, can cover certainly the current fluorophores that you're already using off of the blue laser. The story is same off of the yellow, right? So we released 4 new labels off the yellow. Did a similar concept here, and I'm speeding through this because I really want to get to the resource that Anson and I have been working on. And again, these will not be as bright as PE, and that's kind of the point, right? Because we really want to provide labels that are bright, but that don't spill everywhere and aren't cross-excited. And so to optimize for that, we've really come out with things that actually are honestly quite bright on their own, but have much less spread contribution. And then you can also use them independently with blue labels. And the final one the final set of these, if you will, is 4 off of the red. And so we've got 4 off the red now, really spanning, really, if you will, sort of APC and some of the conjugates all the way up to APC-like brightness, and again, with this concept of having lower spread. But these are static tables, not my favorite thing in the world. Again, Anson and I were kind of talking about this, like, okay, you go to fluorophore selection guides and they're kind of boring, right? Meaning they're tables, there's some narratives, maybe everyone's doing this binning. And so we thought, okay, well, what if we share the data, which we've talked about? Can we talk about spillover spreading? Because that's kind of super important. And then what if we made that interactive? And so that's actually exactly what we've done. So what we've done is create this new fluor selection guide. And what we've got is actually sharing all this data. So you can actually grab all this data. This is just embedded in our site. And so it stacks up all of these. Actually, in this case, they're just sorted by their excitation max. But then you can actually take a look and sort them versus dyes that you're either considering using or looking at replacing. And I think the even more fun part of this is that now you can go in and really look at all of these labels in the context of the laser lines where they're excited. So you can compare, all these labels, and you can also do this on a laser line basis, right? And so what we're looking at here is separation index or brightness versus spread, and this gives you the ability to really navigate that. You can also look at this on a laser line specific basis, right? You can say, okay, I really want to compare, for instance, Caravia blue to Novo blue 610, and you can even zoom in on that area of the graph really to compare these labels, right?
And Mike,
so I think, yeah, go ahead.
Can I interrupt you here? You got a good question.
Yeah, sure.
So why separation index and not staining index?
Great question. The reason that this is customer feedback. The reason we were pushed to look at separation index is because it accounts for the 84th percentile of the negative population. So if you are getting more negative drag up, you should expect to see that versus just looking at the standard deviation, which is what stain index looks at. So separation index, in at least for what we've been pushed to do from some of our customers, should be a more stringent view on what's the brightness versus background. Cool. Awesome question. So given what we've talked about, what's possible and how can we push that a little bit further, right? And so I'll show you some of our new work today as well. So we've previously shown our ability to do a 40 color experiment. I'm going to talk about that briefly, but then I want to put it in context of, okay, now to the question earlier, now that you have all of these labels, then how do you think about panel design differently? Can we take spread out of a high plex panel? It's been something that I've been, we've sort of been really noodling on quite a bit. So this is some work. It was led by Sed in our group, and so what she did is take it was a 35 color backbone, 34 colors of which were, again, conjugates were commercially available. It was put out there by Cytec. We grabbed that and we said, okay, can we plug and play 6 labels on top of that, and what would it mean, right? Because I think that's what's important is if you're able to do that and plug and play, really the view you should look at is I want to add these in, but I don't want to contribute spread, right? I don't want to make the analysis harder, and I want to be able to use this to actually do some real biology. And so we looked at both markers that are highly expressed like CD19 and those that are much more variable or low, like the chemokine receptors with antibodies that are conjugated to our fluors. But to look at this, again, very stringently, right, what we did is actually look at the spillover spreading matrix of the backbone panel, the 34 color backbone. This in many ways is this is sort of what we're leaning on and saying, okay, that's That's the backbone of the panel. And then Seddon ran a really elegant experiment where what she did is take one of our colors at a time, and drop them into this experiment and said, okay, what's the impact, right? If that's the perpetrator, let's quantify the spread impact to all of the other labels that are in here. And I think this has really interesting impacts when you get into like, okay, how do you think about the dye universe? How do you think about high parameter flow? And so again, we're dropping in each one of these at a time. On the y-axis, I'm actually looking at the delta of spillover spreads. In other words, what's the change in the spread when I just add that 35th color that's one of ours. When you add Novo Blue 530, as you'd expect, you get spillover spreading increase for FTSE and BB515, which is already an incredibly challenging combo, something we'll actually revisit in a moment, but no other dyes are affected. In other words, you're adding spread nowhere else into the panel, right? And we'll actually swing back on this because now we've been recommending people use either Novo Blue 530 and FTSE or Novo Blue 530 and BB515. It's a very crowded part of the spectrum, but you can actually lower the complexity by just leveraging Novo Blue on its own. Novo Blue 610 and 660, this is another one of those graphs. It's what you're not seeing that's important, right? And so when you drop these in one at a time, you're actually not seeing any change in the underlying spread. In other words, you're not contributing spread to the underlying panel. You can add plex with essentially no cost. You see a similar story when you look at the Novo yellow dyes. And in fact, what you see is that the increased spread specifically for the labels that they're intended to replace in conventional cytometry, but even then it's marginal, right? So Novo yellow 570, you see these small increases in PE and CF 568. 610, a small change to spillover for PE dazzle, and 660, a small change for PE Sci5. But all of them can be used actually independently, right? And we went and improved that, and not proved it, but then showed all the data, both the deconvoluted data and the raw data. To come up with this, we actually, there were 32 different phenotypes and some deep phenotyping there. You can actually see, I might cause a Zoom black hole because the team actually bought me this, because now it's both on the screen and it's in real life. But we came up with this subway plot to explain the cell phenotypes here, which is something that I wish I had thought of years ago to explain cell phenotyping, particularly when you're communicating to non-flow cytometrists who are like, why are you showing me a gating tree? And then leveraged, this to just communicate this. And I think the important points in a lot of the really interesting conversations that we've had about this and leveraging clean fluorophores in this context hasn't been, oh, you can do you can do tons of phenotyping. It's actually that because we're looking at chemokine receptors here and using very spectrally clean fluors, right? Got really high, if you will, faith that what we're looking at in the chemokine receptors is real, right, across all of these different phenotypes, which turns out to be incredibly important if you're screening for something like lymphopenia. And so very interesting conversations and collaborations now coming out as a cause of leveraging really clean fluorophores in this context. Just a quote actually from one of our other customers, Florian Ebner at Boehringer Ingelheim, and you just, it's like let him speak, right? The 40 color panel's best in class. The approach to not go for the brightest, but the best resolution or least background is really key. And I think we're really trying to think about that notion of if you can do that, then you're able to leverage these high parameter panels, take spread, not out of the equation, but certainly decrease the spread and really increase your ability to do what we're trying to aim for, which is high resolution biology. To quantify that statement though, how do you build up to something even higher, right? And so this has been some continuing work from Seddon, which is how can we leverage the current labels that we have and go to 45 colors and then beyond, right? Because we really want to push that quite high. The first thing we looked at is complexity index, right? Which is a measure of really how difficult is it going to be to deconvolute this panel. So again, she was doing these single color drop-ins. You can see if we do this 34 color drop-in plus Novo Blue 530, we discover where the source of all of the complexity in this panel is. It's having Novo Blue 530 with FTSE and BB515, right? And again, we're coming back to this notion of if you're all the perpetrators and here are the victims, we see these particular issues with respect to BB515. So what does that mean for a future experiment, right? So what we did is actually said, well, the first thing we're going to do is think about a high plex panel, and we're going to remove spillover spreading. And I think that's a really cool concept. We're actually going to go in and replace labels and drop labels out that are causing spillover spread that are leading to difficult data interpretation. And we're going to just take them out, right? And so that's exactly what we've done here. So we've taken BB510 out, BB515 out, and CF568 actually out of this panel. What's the impact of doing that? And then what can you do if you've got clean fluorophores to go in and replace? If you do that, you can actually cause quite an interesting impact. So what you're seeing here is actually the decrease in spillover spreading when we take these labels out, right? And so we take these out, and we got a heck of a lot less spread, right? So we're actually literally taking spread out of the equation. And now the work that we're doing, now that we know that we can remove this spread and have lower complexity panels, is we can actually, if you will, remove those and then add in our labels, which are incredibly clean, to hit similar detectors, right? And accommodate all the same specificities, right? So now we've gone and replaced these. So now we've done a replacement, right, with the aim of less spread. And what we're doing now is also now upgrading that panel, right, with testing 6 new fluorophores with conjugated antibodies in the panel, right? And so this is the kind of thing that becomes possible when you've got this kind of menu, is thinking about adding plex without adding spread. And actually, if you will, taking spread out of some of these traditional dye-based panels. And so pretty exciting work here. You know, we expect to be rolling this up really within the next month and a half. And again, follow the same tactic of sharing the data, sharing the analysis. So with that, in the final several minutes, what are the implications now for life sciences and single cell biology when you think about what, as I've mentioned, this reagent innovation epic, hopefully I've shown you some of the work that we and customers are heading that way. And if you really bake this out, right, when you think about what we do in reagents, be it a sequence tagged antibody, be it a fluorescence tagged antibody, is you've got a detection modality, you've got conjugation chemistry, and then you've got the thing that's determining specificity. The first part of this is really the detection modality. You know, at CYTO2020, I've mapped all the current fluorophore labels and said if you had a 10 nanometer gap where you could detect every single one of those 10 nanometer band passes, we're still pretty limited, right? The spectrum's still limited. And at that point I said, look, I think there's an asymptote here. Turns out, well, I was wrong on that front. Although interestingly enough, it was actually this conversation that led me to someone saying, you know, you should really talk to these guys from Duke, which ended up actually being the photonics team that was just getting started at that time. But the point of all this is that if you really think about it, like I took all of the OMIPs, which are these published panels, and I looked at all of them since 2013. The asymptote is still real, right? We're still not really pushing the barrier in terms of the number of colors that we're adding on here. I mean, I just showed you a 45 color experiment, which will run. You know, people have looked at a 35 color facsymphony experiment. You know, now there's at least a couple of different examples of a 35 or 40 color aurora, right? But we're really still asymptotic in terms of the number of questions we can ask per cell. But the real bigger question asked here is, when I think about this y-axis, you know, even when we're going to be up at 45 or 50 colors, is who moved the cheese? And the answer is sequence tagged antibodies moved the cheese, right? While we were working on 30 color experiments and 28 color experiments and optimizing those, sequence tagged antibodies came out. And the first experiment, which was Vanessa's Peterson's work, you know, came out with ReapSeq in 2017. It was 82 antibodies. Sort of a mind-boggling, right, leap immediately, right? Definitely beyond CyTOF-like moment. And now the current sequence tagged antibodies from medium biology are well past 200, right? And so this is 200, which should be obviously scaling up to 500 questions per cell, right? And so genomics really, in that line of inquiry, moved the cheese. That, to me, is definitely what kicked off if you will, this reagent revolution, this reagent innovation epic, which is where a lot of the work now is going to occur. And I would argue also where a lot of the opportunity lives in reagents. And it's also in many ways a pressure. And what are those pressures? Well, the pressure is on the number of parameters now in a very big way, right? And it's because of the cost to run a single cell sequencing experiment is so very high. And that puts a couple of different pressures on. One is that cost per cell really, you know, we can examine orders of magnitude more cells in flow cytometry and also more patients, more conditions. So it puts that pressure back on the analysis. If you've got a 200 parameter experiment, now you need to reduce that into only 30. That seems a bit limited, right? We'll probably be in the realm where we're running only 10% of the markers that we have in that kind of screening experiment in flow very, very quickly, right? So it puts that pressure in on analysis. So you need to attack that somehow technologically. You need to up the plex. The other thing that's very important in all of this is because the cost per cell is so high, you need to enrich for a population. Magnetic beads only get you so far. You also have to do sorting, and arguably you have to do very high parameter sorting as well, you know, to get to this point where you have a sorted pure population that you then run downstream in these experiments. What are those implications then? Well, the first one is that if you have a limited spectral space, and we do have a limited spectral space, we can't increase it in any way, clean is the new bright. You have to do that because to increase the plex, there's nowhere else to go. If you just keep chucking spread into the equation, you will be where we are now, which is a false asymptote. There will definitely be a pressure on conjugation and customs to deliver a broad range of specificities, right? There just simply is not enough that's on catalog. There are new areas, you know, new markers that are coming out quite regularly. And there's only so much that a customs program, sort of as officially named, will do, which is why we've always been very intense about our conjugation kits. And really, ideally, you need, as one of the customers told me, you really need one reagent to rule them all. So the first thing is on this conjugation kit, really, we've been very intense around sort of following, if you will, the SpaceX model, which is that we want to enable something that's for reuse, and really in this context, panel design. And then we want to have something that brings your friend along, right, with the Crew Dragon module. So we've done that, we followed that. We put out a Cd4 testing kit, which enables people to characterize these labels and then reuse that in their panel design. We also think the conjugation kit's really important. It addresses this notion of how do you leverage that kind of plex? How do you upgrade panels, do it immediately without the context of a slow, for instance, customs program. And then we are also offering conjugated antibodies now to enable to essentially bring your friends with you and attack some of these traditional phenotyping markers. The other part of this, though, is that there are two different reagents that are on our field, right? I mean, if you're sorting based on fluorescence tagged antibodies and then you've got to do a sequenced antibodies, well, you've blocked the moiety because you can't use that same clone. You're also paying twice for that antibody, just, I mean, FYI, and it's not cheap. And it's also really difficult on validation, right? If you have a dropout or if you got a really low number of proteins expressed on that, how do you go back in and then actually validate that that antibody worked? This is something that we've run into, and it's definitely a difficult problem. And so I'd argue that, and I'll show you, you can actually bring these two together. The other one that I think is that we don't talk about much is also conjugation. For what it's worth, if you will, sort of what lay beneath before you ever get onto a flow cytometer is that, particularly with certain dyes, you have a degree of labeling here, which is that the number of dyes you have conjugated to an antibody actually has a Poisson distribution. So before you ever even get on the flow cytometer, you're dealing with a non-quantitative system and quite a bit of variability. What we're driving towards and running a lot of experiments now with respect to is actually controlling this very tightly to the point where you have one phyton for one antibody. You know, we think this has interesting impacts in terms of, okay, what's the variability you have in an experiment, but more importantly, can drive towards quantitation of some of these antigens, real quantitation. So this is, I hope to convince you really, like, we have this platform where you get clean fluorescence and enables this higher number of parameters. We also have a genomic floor, which I think, for me, it's easy to forget because I get excited about the colors and and sort of the high parameter biology. But we can bring together this potential for barcodes and fluorescence onto the same reagent, right? And then that's potential at this point. And so we're working with folks on how best to attack that. And then the other part of this is chemistry innovation. If you have tight control, you can move towards this less distribution and eventually this one-to-one. And those are all items that we're working on now. To the point, we do offer also conjugated antibodies, and we've actually done this by matching up the fluorescence brightness with actually antigen density, and so taking a deterministic approach on offering those. All of these are up on our website, so if you go to phytonics.com in our shop, we've got conjugated antibodies. We also have all of these in the context of conjugation kits. To come back to this question around the menu, we offer all of these in the context of conjugation kits, and the first 6 blue, yellow, green labels I talked about, we've now moved those into conjugated antibodies, and then we'll follow on with the labels that we're talking about now into the same context. So hopefully you've seen some exciting stuff, hopefully some interesting thoughts, at least around what we need to do to innovate in reagents. Coming up next, without a doubt, is Purple Rain. So grab your umbrella. We very much will be in the violet and UV very quickly. And to that point, we've had a lot of customers reach out and say, like, look, these are the dyes, these are the current traditional dyes I'm using in that space. These are the things that I'm seeing either from a practical perspective or from a data perspective. We'd love your help here. So any, feedback, current experience you have there, it helps us immensely in how we think around the violet and the UV space. And it lines up with what Anson was talking about earlier with respect to customer success. We're really attempting to engineer for that by deeply understanding what's going on in the violet and the UV now as well. So with that, I've actually got both of our email addresses up here. You feel free to reach out to either of us, or if you can't remember our names, info@phytonics.com is also good. And then we'll also we should post up that URL for the floor selection guide also into the chat. And with that, happy to hang out and take any questions. Stop my share somewhere. Oh, there it is. Stop share. Hidden behind my monitor. There we go. There. All right, great. Well, I am not seeing any questions, but please feel free to reach out if you do have any. And we also always post up the recording up on YouTube, and we'll reach out as well to follow up. So awesome. Thanks, Anson. Thanks everyone for attending.